The story begins with a girl full of hope bending over a row of haphazardly planted seedlings, which she had accidentally received from kind villagers as if they were precious treasures. But anxious thoughts clouded her mind like a dark cloud. Would she be able to get these fragile plants to take root, or would she risk ruining everything? She sighed deeply as she looked at the scene before her. The girl stopped, confused, trying to decide how best to describe this strange garden. A vegetable garden or a pile of dirt? For some reason, this work exhausted her, even though it had a certain ritualistic quality to it. She still couldn't believe that she had become part of the romantic fantasy world of Ladiana, where fiction and reality were intertwined. Of all the characters, she had the honor of being a secondary villain. Her family, which had fallen apart like a house of cards, and her dark past hung over her like a shadow. The girl dreamed of other roles, but life threw her a completely different script. She mysteriously found herself in the body of Baron Roten's only daughter, Ellie Roten. She had platinum hair as bright as the summer sun and eyes as blue as the clear sky. Her well-defined nose and full lips indicated that Ellie belonged to a noble family. Although she was the daughter of a minor baron, her attractive face was unmatched. In the original story, Ellie Rotten was just a minor character who didn't really add much to the plot. She might have appeared on a few pages at most. For such an insignificant family, she had an extremely wicked nature and lived only for luxury, constantly indulging herself. Therefore, it is quite obvious that society's opinion of her was terrible. No one was surprised that the Rottens gradually buried themselves in debt, which ultimately destroyed them completely. This was mostly due to the extravagant spending of the Baron and his daughter. The smaller the family's fortune became, the more the head of the Roten family got involved in business deals. Finding himself up to his ears in debt, the man abandoned his daughter and fled. The irony of fate is that it was at this moment that the girl settled in the body of Ellie Roten. At that moment, angry creditors gathered outside the house, trying to smoke the Baron out with torches. They threatened to sell his daughter to slave traders if he did not come out. The girl had only a moment to look around, but even that was enough to realize that she had to run away. Life couldn't be better. She took Ellie's place, but she didn't have a penny to her name, and she was constantly being pursued by creditors. She was lucky to find the back door and run away as fast as her legs would carry her. The girl ran without looking back, desperately trying to hide. That's how she stumbled upon a remote mountain village. It was so isolated that outsiders rarely found their way to this corner of the world. Surprisingly, the locals were incredibly kind and allowed the girl to stay in the village. It was fortunate that she found an abandoned hut that had been standing unused for years. After gardening, Ellie could barely straighten her back. She had to go into the house to rest. Her real body was quite strong, and she could work in the ground all day long. But in this body, she only had to move a little to die of exhaustion. Although it was not the weakest she had encountered, it was clearly different, and she could not get used to it. The exterior of the house clearly indicated that it had not been looked after for ages. It was in a state of disrepair, with holes everywhere that needed to be repaired. But Ellie had no choice. She had to live somewhere. Just as she was ready to put her plans on hold and close her eyes for a few minutes of sleep, she heard a suspicious rumbling. It sounded like something heavy had fallen to the ground. Fear gripped the girl's heart, but her curiosity got the better of her. She set off into the unknown to see if her creditors had found her. Ellie found a sturdy broom in her hands, ready to fight off any evil. However, she had no idea that a horrific scene was unfolding before her. A man was brutally beating a defenseless child. The stranger was a burly brunette with a twisted expression on his face, as if someone had stolen something important from him. The boy who had become his victim looked about 5 or 6 years old. For a moment, Ellie froze. The man was beating the little child and smiling sinisterly. Soon, her indignation knew no bounds. With a broom in her hands, she rushed forward, despite the fact that the attacker had the advantage over her. The attacker, glowing with a strange light, reached out to the girl, ready to send her to her insane creator. But suddenly, some desperate force made him retreat, and he was defeated. Ellie, already resigned to the inevitable blow, suddenly felt the man's magic collide with an invisible shield. Shock flashed in his eyes. The girl was no ordinary girl. However, this was only the beginning. The attacker was caught off guard, and while he was trying to understand what had happened, Ellie rushed to save the boy. The man became even more enraged because he did not know where this woman had come from, a woman who was immune to his power. The girl's inner anger reached its limit, and she grabbed the broom to teach the stranger an unforgettable lesson. Ellie beat the man with incredible force, as if it were an everyday occurrence for her. He lost consciousness and fell to the ground. Although he looked so big, he turned out to be a weakling. People like him have enough courage not for real combat, but only to measure their strength against defenseless children. The victim of the attacker sat trembling, covering himself in fear, ready for the worst. If it weren't for Ellie, the fate of the innocent boy could have been tragic. He cried as if every tear was his last, begging for help and calling for his mother with such despair that it was heartbreaking. Ellie hugged the child to show him that he was safe. A feeling previously unknown to the girl, maternal instinct kicked in instantly. She was ready to give everything to stop the boy from crying. While the evil attacker lay on the ground counting stars in his head, Ellie decided to tie him up with a rope. Before doing so, she gathered all her strength and dragged him to the edge of the cliff. Although this village was cut off from civilization, the girl did not want to take any chances. She had to make sure that no one else would see them and ask unnecessary questions in this situation. Even if she left him near her house, the stranger would try to carry out his evil plan again. Something in his gaze was terrifying. She couldn't let that happen because the consequences could be fatal. Ellie looked at the man and savored her triumph. She seemed so fragile, yet she had managed to overpower such a large man. Out of boredom, something interesting caught her attention. A bizarre tattoo adorned the stranger's neck. The main character of this mark was a snake. Even if stones fell from the sky, Ellie thought that she didn't care what it meant. It was as if such tattoos were commonplace for her. Perhaps in her world, such drawings usually had no meaning, but in this world, they indicated membership in some secret and hostile society. Ellie returned to her little house, hoping that the boy would tell her what had just happened. When she went inside, she found that the little person was nowhere to be seen. She was sure she had put him on the bed, hoping that he would feel safe and calm down. It took her a moment to look around the room and find him under the table. The child looked at the girl uncertainly, with a slight note of distrust. He was still scared, wondering what would happen if the evil man returned, or worse, if Ellie turned out to be working with the kidnapper. Still, this place was unfamiliar to the boy, so he expected danger everywhere. Ellie remembered how he had helplessly called for his mother's help. His heart grew colder with every thought that he would not be saved. The girl offered the child some cookies, which she had baked enough to feed an entire army. As expected, the boy obediently stuffed the food into his mouth. Ellie couldn't remember anything like this in the original, so she logically assumed that the child in front of her was also a minor character. She learned that her guest's name was Ryan, but that didn't help her at all. The girl asked the boy a perfectly understandable question about his parents. After all, his disappearance must have caused quite a stir. But just one mention of them made Ryan burst into tears. Ellie found herself in a hopeless situation, not knowing how to calm the child down. After a moment's thought, she decided that a hug always brings comfort. No one gets hurt from it. She pulled the boy close to her, gently stroking his head, but his crying only intensified. Rian felt incredible fear and pain. It became so difficult to breathe. Just a short time ago, he had been sleeping peacefully in his cozy bed when a mysterious man suddenly appeared, kidnapped him from his home, and physically abused him. The girl continued to stroke the child's head and tell him how brave he was for enduring such an ordeal. She asked Rian to lift his head so she could get a better look at his face. This was partly necessary to establish eye contact with him, as what she was about to say could cause an unnecessary reaction. She wanted to help find his parents, but she didn't know how. If Ellie knew where Ryan's home was, she would hardly be able to take him there. So she decided to apologize in advance. This village was deep in the mountains and incredibly difficult to get out of, and it was practically impossible for those who were unfamiliar with the wooded area. The girl was sure that, one way or another, his parents would find their son, and in the meantime, she offered to wait at her hut. Rian reacted to this offer with surprise, but in any case, he had no choice, just like Ellie. She had lived alone for too long, albeit not for long, but now she would not be lonely. So Ellie lived with her companion for several days. During this time, nothing suspicious happened. However, food was running out, and the girl was forced to go to the center of the village to get more. She didn't waste a second to leave her new neighbor, Ryan, in charge. The food was running out incredibly fast, obviously because there was another mouth to feed. When the garden was destroyed, Ellie was left without a single source of income. But life with a child was not a burden for her, quite the opposite. It was a joy. The boy behaved perfectly, causing no trouble. However, Ellie was filled with anxiety. Rian skillfully avoided all questions about his past, as if creating a wall of silence around himself. She couldn't stop thinking about where he really came from. She could have pressured the child, but that seemed like a bad idea, considering the recent incident with that man. Perhaps the boy would trust Ellie more and tell her himself. An unusual buzz was stirring in the village, as a large delegation of knights had arrived. The locals whispered among themselves, frozen with horror upon learning that a magician had kidnapped the Duke's son. The most experienced people were sent to search for him. Upon hearing the news, Ellie's eyes widened like saucers. Who could have guessed that a member of an aristocratic family was hiding under her roof? The kidnapper had already been found, and it was only a matter of time before His Highness's men would burst into the girl's house. And there was only one duke in the empire, the glorious Caden Nathan. There was no task that Caden could not accomplish. Studying, sword fighting, everything came easily to him. His impeccable appearance earned him nothing but admiration and respect. When Caden inherited the duchy, even the Emperor of Rhotatia, Ivan Ricardo, began to fear him. And the Duke's relationship with Lydiana Blonde, the main character, only intensified the Emperor's animosity. The Duke was ready to do anything for Lydiana, but he was unable to win her heart. His obsession with this woman was only the beginning of a fierce confrontation that affected the entire empire. He went so far with this love that he committed crimes, and all because he was just a secondary male character. Ellie was so lost in her thoughts that she didn't notice Rian calling her. He thought she was tired, so he offered to bake bread another time. Ellie assured him that she was fine and that she was just lost in thought. As soon as they decided to put the bread in the oven, their idyll was interrupted as if by the snap of a finger. The knights found Rian sooner than expected. The girl was mistaken for one of the kidnappers and ordered to be imprisoned. Ellie's whole life flashed before her eyes because it was obvious that the sinister Caden would not spare her. What's more, no one would believe that she was the one who had saved the Duke's son. The girl, bound and gagged, was taken to the mansion in the same carriage as Rian. The boy hugged Ellie tightly, tears in his eyes, and desperately begged the knights to let her go, insisting that she was not a kidnapper. Ryan had no intention of leaving his friend, fearing that she would be punished. He tried to delay the moment, But the knights were convinced that Ellie had brainwashed the boy, and their decision was final. What's more, they had no choice. They had to deliver the girl to the Duke, no matter what it took. The estate that Ellie had only read about looked much grander than she had imagined. It was clear that the interior decoration was strikingly superior to the Baron's estate, and the Duke's voice alone sent shivers down her spine. When she saw him in person, Ellie almost fainted from his incredible masculine beauty. He had black hair with a slight blue sheen, and his blood-red eyes radiated menace. His powerful aura emphasized his sculpted face, giving the impression of boundless power. There he was, Duke Caden Nathan himself. Ellie could only silently watch his stern actions, as her mouth was still taped shut. Ryan did not leave the girl's side for a moment, which greatly disturbed Caden. The knights stated that the boy refused to do so on principle. They suspected that Ellie might have used magic to control his mind. The Duke became even more enraged, as he couldn't shake the thought that the girl was willing to do anything to get money, even kidnap a child. Her family was destroyed, like an old tree rotten from the inside. Therefore, she was grasping at any straw to try to restore her roots in the hope of a new life. Caden tore the bandage off Ellie, expecting her to justify herself. The Duke emphasized that whatever Ellie was planning, she would not succeed. She realized that Caden knew everything about her and hastened to declare that it was all a misunderstanding. She had barely made ends meet, running away from debt collectors before finding a place to live. And then a man who had kidnapped Mr. Darien suddenly appeared before her. Caden looked at Ellie suspiciously. This chance encounter seemed strange to him. The girl wanted to say something else, but the Duke shut her mouth, saying that she would be better off keeping quiet until he cut out her tongue. Rian raised his hand to the man's mouth to prevent him from blurting out any more offensive words. After that, Caden ordered the commander of the knights to take the boy away. While the man was carrying out the noisy gentleman, the Duke looked at Ellie again with all his fury. Caden was adamant that the girl was guilty, so without further ado, he threw her into prison. Half a day passed as she sat in a dark room behind bars, desperate to eat, but all she could enjoy was the silence. The Duke tried to find out from the kidnapper what she had done to his son. He was not entirely sure of his actions, because he had brought her to his estate instead of simply sending her to prison. All he had were vague suspicions, without any confirmation of his doubts. And Ellie realized that Aiden needed indisputable proof of her words. The Duke realized that the girl was not as naive as she seemed from the rumors, and she would not be so easy to break. It would seem that at the worst moment of your life, when you are sitting in prison, you need to think about how to escape. But Ellie could only think of Rian. When the knight grabbed the boy, he cried so hard he could barely breathe. In fact, Darien Nathan was not the Duke's biological son. He was the son of Caden's sister and her husband, who tragically died in a terrible accident, leaving the boy an orphan. After that, Ryan got a new family. His uncle, his only living relative, took him under his wing. As the son of his beloved sister, this boy became a precious treasure for the Duke, who couldn't help but love him. From what Ellie had read, the Duke's love for Darien was incomprehensible, beyond words. Sitting in silence, she was lost in thought when she suddenly felt a fever take hold of her body. She was tormented by sudden flashes of heat and cold, though she refused to believe that she was ill. Soon, one of the knights came to the girl, as the Duke had ordered her to be brought to him immediately. Ellie was convinced that she would soon be punished for deeds she had not committed. But Caden just angrily ordered her to put Darien to bed, leaving the girl in a state of deceptive calm. The boy rushed into the arms of his new friend. He didn't like the idea that something might happen to her. He threw such a tantrum that no one in the duchy could calm him down. Before that, Caden had put a suspicious bracelet on Ellie's wrist. The new accessory was supposed to control the girl if she suddenly dared to do something foolish. The Duke warned her with a contemptuous look that if Ellie dared to disobey, she would hardly remain alive. Whatever it was scarier than it seemed at first glance. Caden was taciturn. As he left, he warned the girl to be obedient. He remained confident in his decision and would return in the morning to pronounce her sentence. Darian cried for 6 hours, dreaming of how he would be with Ellie. His gentle, innocent face was swollen, reflecting the deep suffering caused by such cruel injustice. The boy's body trembled, and he tried to hide it with a blanket. No one believed that Ellie was not involved in the kidnapping, and absolutely everyone was convinced that she had brainwashed Darian. The fact that she really hadn't done anything made the situation even more unpleasant. The young man blamed himself for what had happened. However, Ellie convinced him that it was the adults who were to blame for not believing them. Ellie tried to calm Darian down and put him to bed. Up close, he seemed even smaller and more vulnerable. When they first met, she thought the boy was about 5 or 6 years old. However, considering that this is the beginning of the original story, Darian is about 8 years old. At this age, the boy was distinguished by his unusual, slow development, which caused concern among those around him. The young man lay on the bed with his eyes closed, as if the end of his suffering had finally come. But in his quiet sleep, he kept calling for his mother, and tears slowly rolled down his cheeks. The boy really looked deeply saddened, longing for his parents. Ellie, sensing his sadness, bowed her head on the pillow and closed her eyes, waiting for morning to find out the Duke's decision. The next day, Caden threw a stack of documents on the table with determination. His gaze was stern and uncompromising. Ellie knew she had to read and sign everything that was required of her carefully. The girl felt anxious because no one had explained to her why she had been woken up early and brought to the office. The Duke presented Ellie with a fait accompli. She had no choice. Otherwise, she would be sent back to prison. The first thing that caught her eye was the word contract, written in large letters. According to it, the girl had to strictly follow the Duke's orders while working as a nanny. It was obvious that this position was just a cover to keep an eye on her. And the indefinite term indicated that Caden would keep Ellie at the estate until he found out everything about her, or until he found irrefutable proof of her guilt. Of course, the girl didn't like this until something caught her attention. One of the clauses stated that all the Rotten family's debts would be paid off, and later, Ellie would receive double compensation if all suspicions were dropped. This was a compelling argument for her to sign the document without hesitation. The Duke almost imperceptibly hinted that the butler would teach Ellie all the intricacies of the job and let her go. Caden's face showed doubt, as his decision had not been easy. The last condition of the contract seemed generous, but there were certain reasons behind it. Ed Rotten resorted to the services of the notorious Rayon Guild, which had a dubious reputation. The guild was known for its high interest rates and ruthless actions. For Ellie, staying at the Duke's estate was a better alternative than falling into the hands of the guild. After all, there was a risk that she would be sold into slavery. The fact that she will be watched is upsetting, but she is confident that her innocence will be proven. At least the girl has a suspect, the Duke's rival, Marquis Passion Dior. He is the one who watched from the sidelines and waited for the right moment to strike. The butler, Lubert, caught the girl's eye. He immediately showed his affection and escorted her to her room. Now Ellie will be served by other maids. Her main task is to stay close to Mr. Darian and fulfill his every wish. Starting with lunch, Ellie must go down to the dining room with the boy. The biggest shock for the girl was the realization that she had to sit at the same table with the Duke. Albert firmly stated that this was the master's direct will, and she simply could not refuse. Ellie's face showed deep confusion. She hardly dared to think about possible digestive problems because in this world, it seemed, there were no medicines that could save her. The girl felt like a prisoner sitting at the dinner table. The dead silence in the hall only intensified her insecurity and anxiety. Suddenly, the peace was broken. Darian entered the room. He noticed that Ellie hadn't touched her food, but the new nanny was trying enthusiastically to feed the boy. The Duke, watching the scene, couldn't take it anymore and slammed his fist on the table. The atmosphere became increasingly tense. Caden kept looking at Ellie suspiciously, waiting for her to mess up again. Suddenly, the girl herself realized that she was paying too much attention to this. After all, she was not to blame for anything. However, it was all because of the Duke's bloodshot eyes, which looked as if they were about to throw daggers. It was hard to believe that a man with such a stern gaze would ever fall in love with the heroine. Ellie sat thinking about whether Caden's expression would ever soften. But, gathering her thoughts, she decided not to dwell on it and just do her job as a nanny. Soon, the Duke got up from the table without saying a word to Ellie or Darian. The girl was outraged by the man's behavior, but she managed to hide her feelings, remaining calm, at least on the outside. Instead, the nanny suggested that Darian finish his meal after his father. She stood up abruptly, her head spinning, and suddenly the world around her darkened. She lost consciousness. The young gentleman immediately began to raise the alarm and attracted the attention of the Duke. The girl felt as if she had entered another dimension. She noticed Caden standing next to a mysterious figure in a robe. The man suddenly changed. His face became strangely soft, and this aroused Ellie's genuine interest. She focused on his words, but none of them reached her ears, as if they disappeared into thin air. What she saw resembled a scene from the original story. The girl couldn't understand why she was being shown this. Looking closer, Ellie realized that she was actually standing next to the Duke. Suddenly, the nanny was overcome with horror and woke up immediately. She couldn't understand why she had dreamed such a thing. Rian was waiting by the bed, crying, for the girl to wake up. The young lady suddenly remembered that she had fainted during lunch with the boy. But what shocked her most was the realization that she had been unconscious for a whole day and a half, although it seemed as if time had stopped. Ellie did not expect her illness to be so serious. Her condition improved, but her temperature was still high. The doctor strongly recommended that she take medication for several days. The Duke was concerned that the girl's health problems could affect Darian, but he was assured that this was unlikely. However, he did not want to take any chances and ordered a thorough examination of his son. Darian insisted on being allowed to stay with Ellie. The girl was also convinced that it was not necessary to take the boy away and that it could wait. But Caden was adamant in his decision. He gave Ellie a stony look, as if to indicate that she had no right to interfere. Darian was devastated, but the girl really couldn't do anything because the Duke's word was law. Caden was left alone with Ellie. He was outraged that the girl seemed to think her tricks would be enough to win Darian's trust. Ellie, on the other hand, was beginning to get annoyed that the Duke was just trying to catch her in a lie. The man was convinced that it was all a meaningless performance and that the girl was just playing the role of a saintly innocent. In his opinion, people like Ellie would never risk themselves for someone else unless they had something to gain from it. In the original story, Ellie radiated boundless malice and greed. However, Caden did not know that he was dealing with a different Ellie Rotten. He grabbed her shoulders with hostility, and an unpredictable feeling boiled up inside him. The Duke insisted that he would prove Ellie's involvement with the kidnappers. Darian firmly believes that the girl saved him, but Caden has no doubt that this supposed accident was staged. Ellie was forced to listen silently to the Duke, tired of proving her innocence yet again. During this one-sided conversation, she learned that she was under an invisible curse. Considering that she thought the Duke was talking nonsense, she did not attach any importance to his words. She did not even try to justify herself to Caden, which he ultimately took as an admission of guilt. Ellie was not bothered by the agreement or the prospect of returning to prison. She knew that with the Duke's constant distrust and difficult character, everyone would leave him sooner or later. It was obvious. Caden would die alone, abandoned by everyone, like a light gradually fading away. These words struck the Duke like a sword, and he clenched his fist in anger. Ellie, almost overcome with fear, realized she had spoken rashly. The man quietly left the room without saying a word. Ellie's words shocked him, even though there was nothing unusual about them, and suddenly she felt that there was something deeper hidden in that moment. The girl had used a phrase from the main character, Lydian. In the original version, the Duke became obsessed with her immediately after that. Ellie felt uneasy. Would she replace Caden's original target? But according to the plot, Ellie Rotten was an insignificant character, so that was simply impossible. The girl thought about the curse. When she saved Darian, the mage could have done something to cause her great trouble. The girl had never felt any changes in herself, but the curse could have been working imperceptibly and gradually. Falling into a rage, the Duke grabbed her so hard that he left a painful bruise on her wrist. Before taking a relaxing bath, Ellie asked the maid to bring her some ointment. Annie was flustered, which immediately caught the girl's attention. What's more, there was a suspicious dark spot on the maid's leg. The maid insisted that she had just bumped into something and that there was no cause for concern. But at that moment, she rushed to the exit like a criminal about to be caught red-handed. In the darkness of the night, when silence enveloped the room, Darian plunged into the world of dreams next to Ellie. But at that moment, as his vigilance weakened, something mysterious and unusual began to happen around them. The maid quietly entered the young master's room to replace the candle. She did not know that her actions would wake Ellie. Annie explained that Darian was in poor health and that the candle with herbs must always burn for him. Ellie immediately became alert because the maid had come in so quietly as if she were an invisible shadow. Moreover, the candle burning on the table looked almost new. A question crept into her mind. Why change it? The girl smelled the usual scent of herbs, but she extinguished the wick anyway. It seemed that her imagination was running wild, but numerous signs suggested that there was undoubtedly something cunning and mysterious going on here. Ellie opened the window, letting fresh air into the room. Thoughts about whether she should share her suspicions with the Duke kept her awake. There was an unpredictable risk in the air. From the window, Ellie saw the Duke returning to the estate, and her heart skipped a beat. She approached the guard who was guarding the young lord's chambers and asked permission to see Caden. The Duke could not refuse, believing that at such a late hour he would not be reproached for a trifle. The young lady felt somewhat uncomfortable, but she wanted her intentions to help to be taken seriously. Ellie told him how the Duke had bruised her and that she had had to turn to the maid for help. Noticing her pain, the man didn't think twice about giving her medicine to save time and speed up the conversation. Annie was eager to get to Caden, as the maid's behavior had made a strange impression on her. She quietly entered the room where Ellie was sleeping sweetly with Darian, planning to change the candle. Waking up unexpectedly, the girl noticed that the maid looked extremely frightened, as if she had been caught red-handed. Ellie had no evidence, only cunning suspicions swirling in her head. Her indignation grew with every passing minute because Caden did not take the situation seriously. The Duke, sometimes strange in his behavior, began to doubt the girl, and this only added fuel to the fire. The man confidently announced that the situation had changed dramatically. The curse on Ellie's body confirmed his words. It turned out to be a unique manifestation of subjugation magic that intended to take control of her. The curse wove itself into an invisible web of brainwashing, causing ruthless enslavement. Ellie felt deeply confused because the Duke did not believe her, despite all her attempts to explain anything. Every moment of their conversation was a waste of time. Ever since the girl found herself in this body, the original plot had been falling apart before her eyes, and the current timeline was becoming increasingly confusing. Caden's relentless indifference caused Ellie genuine disappointment. His calmness seemed to ignore all her previous words, as if yesterday's conversation had passed him by without leaving a trace. After that, the nanny was so absorbed in her thoughts that no food touched her lips. This alarmed Darian, and sensing their unity, he also refused to eat in order to support her. Ellie smiled at the young gentleman's kind words, but the real warmth in her heart came from Darian's selfless concern, as he tried in every way to cheer her up, and this made a big impression on her. The girl suggested that the boy bake cookies, thinking that it would help them become closer. However, after a delicious lunch, the young man already had classes scheduled. Ellie assumed that the Duke would allow his son to skip school, as he couldn't be that petty. Caden looked at the girl dismissively and said they could do whatever they wanted. Darian enthusiastically prepared delicious treats, hoping to share them with his father. Although Ellie did not want to go to the Duke, she could not refuse when she saw the excitement in the boy's eyes. Caden was sitting in his study, immersed in his work, when suddenly the door opened. His son, full of optimism, entered and offered his father some delicious cookies, hoping to cheer him up. The Duke, lost in his thoughts, didn't even notice the basket of treats and rejected the offer. However, Darian wasn't going to give up and insisted that Caden try some. The man angrily threw all the cookies on the floor, leaving a big mess. Ellie was puzzled by this incomprehensible behavior, while deep resentment flared up in Darian's heart. The boy, covered in tears, shouted that he hated his father and then instantly ran out of the office. Caden was struck by this confession. He never thought it meant so much to his son. Ellie had imagined many scenarios, but this one had never crossed her mind. She stood at the young man's door, waiting impatiently and anxiously for him to finally let her in. In the end, she accepted that Darian needed to be alone. He looked very frightened, and perhaps it would have been better for him to do his homework instead of baking cookies. Although what had happened was unexpected, Ellie had never seen the Duke react like this to his son's words before. The situation could have been avoided if he had simply agreed to eat the cookies. Ellie stared intently at the sleeping Darian, her heart filled with relief. She knew that the boy was finally feeling a little better, and that moment gave her comfort and hope. Not long ago, he had enjoyed a delicious pie made by his nanny, and she had even promised to bake it with him next time. A sudden knock on the door brought Ellie back to reality. A familiar voice came from behind the door, and Ellie allowed herself to hope that it was Annie. Whoever had come had news. The Duke was waiting for her. However, the girl remembered how Caden had recently left the estate. Although even he hadn't come to dinner, what worried Ellie most was that, because of the recent incident, the Duke couldn't call for her in the middle of the night. A doubt still lingered in her mind. Something was wrong. If it was a real order, Ellie couldn't ignore it. That night, an unusual silence reigned in the mansion, which was both frightening and mesmerizing. The girl decided to ask the maid how her leg was. The nanny had noticed earlier that Annie had a bad bruise. Today, with her leg wrapped in bandages, the maid assured her that everything was fine. But there was a look of despair in her eyes that could not be ignored. Ellie pretended that her stomach hurt so she could sit down on the floor and untie the bandage. Only when the last threads disappeared did the girl see the mark, the same one as Darian's kidnapper had, which made her shudder. The nanny didn't have time to confirm that Darian was safe when a mage suddenly appeared and grabbed her by the hair. He pushed the girl hard against the window, which opened under the pressure. His eyes burned as he demanded to know the boy's whereabouts. Judging by his appearance, he looked like he had just escaped from prison. While the man was trying to deal with the nanny, he ordered the maid to find Darian. A picture flashed in Ellie's mind. During their last meeting, the attacker had used magic. Ellie was surprised that the man was unable to find Darian with the help of magic. His indignation finally overflowed, and believing that the girl was just mocking him, he pushed her out of the window. The girl could not even imagine that her life would end right there. But suddenly, the Duke's strong arms caught her, and the nanny did not have time to wonder how Caden had appeared nearby. Traces of the real kidnapper were finally found in the mansion, and the Duke could not ignore this threat. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, he urgently sent knights to put an end to this danger. At that moment, the magician looked out the window and saw Caden. The original plan was ruined because the Duke had returned earlier than expected. Therefore, the attacker was instantly overcome by the desire to escape before he was caught. Caden found himself in the same trap as Ellie. When rumors began to spread that the girl had called him out into the street, the Duke instantly realized that this was just a clever trap for him. Ellie was no fool either. She was the first to notice that something suspicious was going on at the estate. Before leaving for her supposed meeting with the Duke, she hid Darian. When they returned to the room, they were met with a scene of devastation. Things were scattered everywhere, evidence of a thorough search. Ellie was overcome with panic. What if they had found the boy? Her heart began to beat faster. But according to the magician, they had not been able to find the child. Suddenly, the floor opened, and Darian appeared. Ellie hugged the boy with relief, feeling that the threat to his life had passed. The nanny peacefully reassured the young master, assuring him that there was no longer any reason to worry. She sincerely thanked the Duke for his courage. If it weren't for his saving hand, she might not have lived to see this moment. Ellie was unsure about Caden. After all, he had just caught a man falling from the second floor. Forgetting all the rules, she rushed over to him to make sure he was okay. People's appearances can be deceiving, as deep inner trauma often hides behind a mask of normality. Until that moment, Ellie and Caden had never been so close to each other. Ellie immediately blushed and took a few steps back. She was overcome with concern for the Duke. At that moment, she subconsciously acted as she always did with Darian. Although the man looked as if he didn't care, his eyes betrayed his inner conflict. This time, he did not reject the nanny's concern as he had done before, when he had been rude and cold. Fearing for his son's health, the Duke quickly approached him, checking for injuries. He ordered Darian to stay with the knights, deciding that he would deal with the rest of the situation himself. Ellie watched as her child was almost kidnapped again, while Caden remained strangely calm. The Duke knew that he could not show weakness in front of his own son, even at such a critical moment. If he revealed his emotions, Darian would feel fear. Although the Duke had always been cold and distant toward Ellie, he showed unusual attention and care toward his own child. Suddenly, Ellie realized that she liked this new perspective. Of course, Darian was important to Caden. There was no doubt about that. And the girl wondered with curiosity what that would mean for her. Suddenly, the Duke picked Ellie up by the shoulder and carried her away. She hoped that at least this time she would not be interrogated. The girl believed that Caden would not be so petty. Everything began to happen quickly. The Duke, like a sack of potatoes, dragged the nanny into a room where knights had already gathered to punish the kidnappers and their accomplices. During the search, several servants were found to have the same markings on their necks as the magician. However, the criminals were in no hurry to reveal the name of their mysterious client. leaving room for speculation. The chief thief was not afraid at all, believing that even in captivity, his story was not over yet. Caden suddenly grabbed the magician by the head and, wanting to finish him off, slammed him to the floor with all his might. Ellie froze in surprise, feeling cold sweat cover her forehead. She knew that the Duke had indescribable strength, but she was surprised to realize that his energy could crack even the floor like thin ice. However, Caden had a different opinion. The contract under which the Marquis of Dior had hired the magician was proof of that. The kidnapper's face twisted in an instant, from a sly smile to complete disappointment. The Duke easily obtained confirmation in the Magic Tower. He offered the head of the organization incredible rights to extract magic crystals, and the latter agreed without hesitation. The document that Caden showed the magician was official confirmation that the man had been expelled from the Magic Tower. The kidnapper desperately defended his position, claiming that this was nothing more than a conspiracy against him. And so, everything was resolved without much effort. The only thing that worried Ellie was that with her appearance, the original began to change little by little. Although she was convinced that the Duke was capable of dealing with any problem. Caden noticed Ellie's watchful gaze on him. The girl awkwardly remarked that she was admiring the Duke's incredible beauty. Since everything was over, she assumed she was free to go. The man said that the nanny could do whatever she wanted. However, she was not sure if the Duke would call her back for questioning at any moment. At least for now, she was no longer on the list of suspects. When Darian saw Ellie, his heart skipped a beat and he rushed to her. The boy assured her that he wasn't afraid because he believed she would do anything to save him, even risk her life. He didn't understand why the nanny was apologizing, because that was something bad people who tried to kidnap him again should do. He also hopes that one day his father will apologize to Ellie, too. Although the misunderstanding between them has now been resolved, Caden is not the kind of person who would ask for forgiveness. Ellie smiled and said that sometimes it's better not to know. It had been a rather stressful day for the girl, but since the kidnapping issue had been resolved, Ellie would be able to return to her peaceful, everyday life. A banquet in honor of the Emperor's birthday was to take place in the near future. All aristocrats invited to the banquet had to attend with a partner if they were unmarried. Therefore, Albert asked Ellie to be the Duke's partner. The girl realized with horror that, according to the plot, it was at this event that Caden first met Lydiana. The nanny thought that it wasn't such a bad idea to attend the banquet. After all, there she would be able to see if the original plot was developing in the right direction. Ellie was tormented by doubts. Would the Duke really leave her at the estate? Suddenly, like a bolt from the blue, Caden ordered his servants to quickly prepare the girl for the luxurious banquet. She had never looked so stunning. Her beauty sparkled and filled the space around her. Darian couldn't take his eyes off the nanny. She was always perfect to him, but today she was especially so. Ellie blushed at such flattering words. The boy confessed that she had taught him such phrases. When he saw the girl, the Duke was speechless for a moment. However, he quickly pulled himself together. Darian also wanted to attend the banquet with his nanny. She suspected that the boy was still offended by the Duke, but she hoped that he would soon forget about the cookie incident. And so it happened. Caden apologized to his son for his rash behavior. The man handed the boy a bag of treats. Although it was nothing compared to what Darian had done, it should still be tasty. The long-awaited reconciliation between father and son gave Ellie peace of mind. But silence reigned in the carriage rushing to the imperial palace. The girl couldn't believe that the Duke was immersed in business again. Upon arriving at their destination, Caden elegantly offered his hand to Ellie. It was then that she noticed once again how attractive the man was. Upon entering the banquet hall, all eyes were on the couple. Ellie felt awkward, as she had never had such an experience before. Caden noticed that the girl was uncomfortable there, so he took her by the hand to make her feel more at ease. At their first meeting, the Duke's gaze had captivated and frightened the girl. But now, to her surprise, she felt an indescribable sense of relief. Suddenly, a figure with an ironic smile appeared. It was the Marquis Passione Dior. The man was instantly interested in Ellie. Noticing that Caden had brought her as his partner, the Marquis decided that there was a special connection between them. Meanwhile, the Duke noticed that Passion was showing too much interest. Without wasting a moment, he rushed over to them. The Marquis noticed that the girl seemed very familiar to him. His heart beat faster as he looked closely, trying to remember whose charming face it was. Ellie felt as if she were standing in front of a dangerous snake. Caden, sensing the tension, tried to lighten the mood by pointing out that his partner needed some rest due to her delicate constitution. The Duke saw no point in continuing the unpleasant conversation with the Marquise, so he decided to take Ellie with him and leave first. It took Passione only a minute to remember the identity of the mysterious girl. As he left, he gave Ellie some inappropriate advice not to get too attached to the Duke. Stepping out onto the balcony, Caden remarked that the girl was overreacting. Ellie admitted that she hadn't been to a banquet in so long that she needed time to get used to the atmosphere. And with disgust, she added that the Marquis de Dior actually looked even more despicable than she had expected. However, when the circumstances finally changed, she realized that Caden had been standing nearby the whole time, watching her. With a mysterious smile, he hinted that he would not stay at the banquet until the end. And after the gift-giving ceremony was over, even the emperor would leave the celebration. After a while, a girl appeared on the balcony. But seeing the Duke there with Ellie, she apologized for disturbing the couple. That girl turned out to be Ladiana. In the original, this is where Caden's obsession with her began. Ellie realized that if Ladiana left the room, everything would change. She had to act. After all, the future of their story was in her hands, and time was running out. The girl smiled awkwardly, then said that she could leave so that Ladiana could be alone with the Duke. But she didn't take into account that Caden would decide to leave on his own. Ellie rushed to the Duke to stop him, but it was too late. The situation was out of control. Ladiana noticed how the stranger tensed up, and there was tension in the air. Ellie clutched her head, desperate, not knowing what to do next. Suddenly, Ladiana asked curiously how the girl knew her name. A gust of wind blew and ruined the lady's hairstyle, revealing her shiny pink hair. Ellie, without hesitation, approached the stranger, deciding to help. Ladiana was struck not only by her beauty, but also by her kindness, and wanted to know the name of this sensitive girl. She knew that her openness could lead to trouble. If Ellie admitted who she was, it would cause problems. But she didn't want to prolong the intrigue. After that, she decided to leave the company of the infamous Ellie Rotten right away. After all, the girl's reputation was more important to her. Emperor Ivan Ricardo thanked everyone for attending the festivities. And now it was time for gifts. Seeing His Highness in person, Ellie emphasized his extravagance. This was the image of the main character. The Duke had prepared a special gift for Ivan, exactly as described in the original, a sacred sword endowed with the power of possession. According to the novel, the Duke found it in a forgotten ancient temple. Usually, the sword was kept in the temple, but this one was different. Possession is not an ordinary god, but an ancient, forgotten creature. He is the lord of death and curses, the god of darkness. The emperor was impressed by such a valuable gift. In a normal situation, this would have ended in a verbal battle. But today, everything went surprisingly smoothly. Ellie hoped that such minor changes would not matter to the overall plot. She dreamed of her home, where there was comfort and warmth. After the stormy banquet, calm descended. The days passed slowly, and in the silence, she felt her dreams of home come alive again. Since the charges against Ellie had been dropped, the attitude toward her at the estate had softened considerably. Even the knights who had previously despised her became friendly. At the estate, the girl finally learned the names of those who had always been around her. She also noticed how Darian began to grow every day, freed from the mysterious herbs that had been holding him back. The Duke's magnificent estate was bustling with life, but Ellie felt a weight on her heart. The mark of her father's slap adorned her cheek when he appeared, hoping that his daughter would beg Caden for money for him. The girl couldn't shake the feeling of anxiety. The Baron, desperate because of his debts, was ready to sell his daughter into slavery to get rid of his loans. It was a terrible price to pay for his mistakes. Ellie would never ask the Duke for money for the Baron. She hoped she would never have to see him again. The mere thought of her father made the girl furious. She was ready to slap him at least once. Ellie had only recently managed to clear her name. Dariana was worried about her nanny's swollen cheek. Instead, the girl was concerned that her ward had missed breakfast. The boy assured her that he had simply been absorbed in his studies. Despite being late, Ellie and the young gentleman entered the bright dining room. The Duke looked as usual, cold and reserved, but his actions, nevertheless, indicated positive changes in his relationship with Ellie. With a mysterious smile, Caden handed out bags of medicinal herbs throughout the estate, arousing everyone's curiosity. While Darian honed his sword skills, Ellie went to the library in search of literary treasures. The book that fell into Ellie's hands instantly captivated her. She found a portrait that filled her mind with mysteries. The Duke, entering the room, noticed Ellie's interest and noted the girl's trained eye. Caden, remembering his sister Becky, confessed that he had painted her portrait during happier times. Leaning closer to the painting, the Duke suddenly realized that he had forgotten about this precious item. Ellie felt a moment of awkwardness, apologizing for intruding on Caden's personal space, but he smiled and assured her that it didn't matter, because her impeccable taste was more important. He pointed to the book, noting that it was a well-written novel and quite interesting. Ellie was embarrassed because the book was actually blank. The Duke was surprised because he could clearly see that something was written there. The girl felt her heart beat faster. The knights appeared to check if the book was filled with words. She held her breath, quickly turning the pages, when suddenly she cut herself on the edge of the paper. She wanted to prove she was right, but instead accidentally summoned real magic. A magical creature suddenly appeared, but Caden didn't lose his cool. With casual determination, he neutralized it with one powerful blow. He then ordered the knights to request an audience at the magic tower and to search the estate. The girl stood in awe, not realizing how her touch to the book had changed everything around her. Ellie was overcome with anxiety. She was afraid that something strange would happen again, and she would accidentally find herself at the center of events. It was not difficult for the Duke to guess what the nanny was thinking. Therefore, he assured her that he would not question her further. Caden remembered Ellie's words about the maid. After the criminals were caught, the Duke examined all the candles in the mansion. It turned out that they contained toxic plant extracts. Colorless and odorless, they were difficult to detect. This was only possible with the help of the magic tower. Then it became clear why Rian looked younger. Caden would never have found out about this plan. And, as she claimed, the book turned out to be completely empty. Ellie couldn't wrap her head around it. She never would have thought that the Duke would react this way. It was because Caden had lost someone dear to him. And to understand that, one had to experience something similar. She was restless and couldn't sleep, so she decided to take a walk in the garden. Perhaps it was because she was here for the first time at this hour, but everything seemed different. Suddenly, she caught the Duke's eye. Apparently, the man was also suffering from insomnia. The girl suggested they take a walk together. He looked at Ellie suspiciously once again and uttered his favorite phrase, "Do as you wish." Then he started walking, and the girl rushed after him. She asked the Duke why he had saved her. The man concentrated and asked a question that made Caden think. Although he was still hunting for evidence against Ellie, his mind was consumed by thoughts of her strange devotion to Darian. The Duke, though he denied his belief, could not hide the note of apology in his voice. The girl revealed her secret. Her actions stemmed from a desire to protect. The suffering boy was right in front of her, and the mage who had wronged Rihanna deserved retribution. Caden was struck by the girl's selflessness. Ellie had another important question for the Duke about the curse. The Duke confessed that Allegro Vian, the master of the mysterious magical tower, had long wanted to meet the girl. He hoped that the magician could lift the curse and free her from this misfortune. Ellie had read about him in a book, but there he was described as eccentric and greedy. It was he who had told the Duke about the curse, and this meeting could help Ellie. The magician, driven by a thirst for knowledge, was curious to study the girl. Caden sent a signal to the nanny not to get attached to the Lord of the Tower, but to use him for her own purposes. Ellie realized that men were not for partnership or friendship. The Duke said he would arrange a meeting in the near future. Ellie need not thank him. It was enough for her to take good care of Darian. Ellie didn't think she would see Allegro today and was a little nervous. The man was indescribably glad to see the lady. For a moment, the girl even thought that she and the magician had switched places. Her position was indeed quite ambiguous. Allegro was eager to see Ellie. The Duke's story about her had captivated the man, but most importantly, he was interested in the girl's well-being. Allegro expected that his presence would somehow affect Ellie, and she would start trembling with fear or gasping for breath. However, the girl felt quite well. This turn of events surprised the magician. He had heard of similar cases, but he did not think it was so serious. It was surprising that Ellie had been cursed and it had no effect. Then she opened the enchanted book without any problems. This was one of the reasons why Ellie wanted an audience with the Lord of the Tower. Allegro hoped that the girl would call him by his name. Ellie pointed out that it was inappropriate. The man insisted that she could please him just this once. He really wanted to hear his name from Ellie's lips. Then the girl realized that this was not an easy request. Allegro was suspiciously insistent. The man declared that the lady's curse had lost its power. The magician approached Ellie insistently, but his magic only bounced off her, giving the girl reasons to be annoyed. He was beginning to lose patience, not understanding why she was not succumbing to his tricks. Ellie's goal was to find out how to remove the curse, but she realized that Allegro himself had no idea. The man smiled awkwardly, because the girl should have figured it out long ago. The thing was, magic had no effect on her. The reason was simple. Ellie had no mana at all. Mana originally comes from the heart. Every person, even those incapable of using magic, has at least a small amount of it. Even a newborn baby. Everyone except the dead has mana. And the most amazing thing is that Ellie is alive. Allegro was more interested in this unusual situation than the girl herself. He hoped that she would agree to take part in his experiments. There could be side effects that would ruin Ellie's beauty, but Allegro assured her that he would be as careful as possible. The girl was quite shocked by this proposal. It seemed to her that the magician had completely lost his mind. Without hesitation, she refused to be a guinea pig. Then Allegro offered to lift the curse from Ellie and infuse her body with mana in exchange for her participation in his research. Although she was immune to magic, the man assured her that he had a trick up his sleeve. It was simple. She needed to absorb a large amount of mana stones. If there were enough to completely fill the room, then everything would work out. Ellie was outraged by the magician's behavior. He allowed him to touch her, which forced the Duke to intervene. Caden warned Allegro not to talk nonsense. The Duke grabbed the magician by the arm and threw him across the sofa. It turned out that Caden had been watching him and Ellie the whole time, and when he felt that the situation was escalating, he couldn't stand aside. The magician called the Duke a stalker. That was the last straw for Caden. He covered the magician's mouth and ordered him to get out. The man's plans were ruined, and he left sadly, muttering something under his breath. Ellie was curious to know if the Duke had really been watching them. Caden said he was just passing by and decided to stop the magician. His answer sounded too categorical, which made him look even more suspicious. The Duke hesitantly handed the girl a packet of documents. A look of confusion appeared on her face. It was the contract they had signed just recently. Caden wanted to rewrite some of the terms of the agreement. The clause on compensation was subject to change. The Duke wanted to reduce it by half. Ellie did not expect such unprecedented greed from him. She thought that cutting the compensation so much would be too much. Caden pointed to another clause he wanted to change, which determined the term of the contract. The Duke gave Ellie a choice. If she did not want to lose the compensation, then he would change the term. The girl dreamed of financial independence, so she agreed to the condition. Despite the charges, the contract remained in force, always under the control of the Duke, who had complete power over her life. Ellie was surprised by this statement. The man, however, did not understand the girl's reaction. In his opinion, it was a normal change, and there was nothing surprising about it. Ellie couldn't understand how she had gotten herself into something like this. Darian couldn't contain his excitement as he told his nanny about his successes in school. He imagined how one day, skillfully wielding a sword, he would follow in his father's footsteps and reach the same heights. The boy noticed that Ellie was unusually quiet today and assumed she was tired. In fact, there were two reasons for this. The first was the Lord of the Allegro Tower, and the second was the Duke himself. The girl tried to pretend that nothing had happened, but she found it difficult. Darian noted that although he did not like his father, he hoped that Ellie would stay at the estate. He looked sad. He was worried that the nanny might feel out of place. The boy apologized for thinking only of himself, but he really wanted Ellie to be his mother. She had become everything to him. Despite the gossip, she held a special place in his heart. Ellie could sense this, but the nature of his feelings remained a mystery to her, one that she was eager to unravel. The young gentleman thought about his father, whose pain had radically changed his view of the world. Darian did not always understand Caden's feelings. His grandparents were usually indifferent to him. Every mistake the young Duke made was a reason for his contempt. Raising an heir with strictness is one thing, but the way the boy actually grew up was more like abuse than discipline. Caden's complete distrust, cold behavior, and lack of empathy were the result of an abnormal childhood. Darian understands that his father pays close attention to him because he cares about him. Caden never lets his son leave the estate, protecting him from danger. Locked within four walls, the boy feels lonely and devastated, like an invisible prisoner in his own world. Darian hugged Ellie, hoping to pour out his soul to her. When he first saw her, he thought he was going to die. But then she saved him. Ellie cannot fully understand what Darian has been through, but in the end, she can only try to imagine. She doesn't mind if the boy sees her as his mother because she loves him as much as he loves her. These words touched Darian so much that he couldn't hold back his tears. How could you not love a child who follows you so blindly and desperately? As she drifts off to sleep for the second time, Ellie feels as if she has entered another reality, and she is beginning to get used to it. She thought that if you have a clear idea that you are asleep, you should wake up. She had clear memories of what happened before she fell asleep. Ellie was puzzled when she saw the prison in the Duke's mansion. This indicated some striking changes in the plot. However, She could not understand what had led to this. Ellie heard a familiar voice, and in an instant, the hated Marquis Passione Dior appeared before her. The girl thought that this dream was about her and that she was imprisoned in handcuffs. But what was her surprise when she saw Duke Caden Nat in that place? Ellie wanted to ask a question, but she couldn't speak. In this terrible dream, the Duke was branded a traitor. It was difficult for the girl to understand what was happening. Her body was betraying her. Her consciousness was fading. Her last memory was the face of the Marquis de Dior celebrating his victory. Darian's cries brought the girl back to her senses. He did not leave the nurse's side for a moment, hoping that she would come to her senses. Ellie was delirious again due to her high fever. This time, it took a day for her to regain her strength. Ellie assumed it was because of the horror she had experienced. For some reason, she had the same dream twice. But now, the dream was about the Duke. She had many questions and no answers. But the surprises did not end there. Then, when the sun was already playing in the rays, Lydian came to the Duke's estate. This surprised Ellie, as she thought everyone would be avoiding the Rothans. However, the appearance of Mrs. Blonde marked a fateful meeting. Ellie agreed to let Lydian braid her hair. In the novel, they both admired elegance, loved to read books, and enjoyed various sweets, which added a special charm to their communication. One evening, they agreed to visit a bakery. While the ladies gossiped and enjoyed each other's company, time flew by, and the guests had to hurry to the Temple of Rubira to seek the wisdom of the high priest. It was the largest temple in the empire. Even His Highness himself visited it. Here, they worshipped the god Carmadan. Suddenly, Ellie realized that the Marquis of Dior visited there from time to time. Recent events flashed through the girl's mind like vivid flashbacks. The contract with the magician, the meeting with the Marquis at the luxurious banquet. Ellie was shocked to realize how she could have forgotten such important things. Suddenly, Lydian felt a touch. It was a friend who confidently grabbed her hand. Without waiting for an invitation, Ellie decided to join them. However, Mrs. Blonde reacted strangely to the unexpected proposal. Ellie had been overly enthusiastic, so she apologized and said she would like to visit the temple with Lydiana another time. She thought it was a good idea, so she blurted it out without thinking. First, she needed the Duke's permission. Contrary to her expectations, he would only agree if he could accompany her. Darian, on the other hand, did not like that the nanny spent almost all her free time with Lydiana. One could even say that he was jealous, watching the merry company from the sidelines. Ellie wanted to take the boy with her to the temple, but the Duke was categorically against it. He was worried that someone would attack his son again. Many believed that it would be safer for Darian to stay at the estate. The kidnappers had already gotten inside, and the girl thought that the young man would feel safer and more protected with her and the Duke. It's not humane to keep your son locked up, thought Caden when he finally relented. He allowed the boy to join the trip, provided he stayed close to him and the knights. Darian was overjoyed. The Duke plunged back into his work, so much so that he couldn't tear himself away from it for a moment. Ellie felt uncomfortable, knowing that she had forced him to leave his work in such a comfortable environment. The girl noticed a cut on Caden's neck, and like a mother, asked if her son was all right. Darian also spoke nervously, worried about his father. The Duke began to look disapprovingly at Ellie, as if she had made a fuss over a minor wound. The girl understood everything without words and promised not to stick her nose where it didn't belong anymore. Mrs. Blonde was happy to meet her friend near the Temple of Rubira. She noticed the Duke's family and introduced herself with the same enthusiasm. Ellie was surprised by the Duke's reaction, as if he had some connection with Lydiana. Ellie didn't have time to delve into this chaos, as her friend quickly led everyone on a tour. Caden had to leave, as he had an important meeting with the high priest. Lydia noticed that her friend and Darian looked very much like mother and son. Ellie was pleased to hear this, as it showed how close they were. There were few priests in the temple because a purification ritual was taking place. This ceremony was held every month, and most of the temple servants were busy with their duties, so it was difficult to find them nearby. Lydian led Ellie and the young gentleman to a large prayer hall. The incredibly large space lived up to its name, and even the statues were just as magnificent. Perhaps that was why Ellie felt so strange. The source of the sacred energy that had enveloped her since her arrival was based here. Touching the monument, the girl felt a strong blow that threw her back. She found herself in a magical field, and in her hands was a white bird that seemed unusual, as if brought from another world. A second later, the girl found herself back in the temple, still confused by what she had experienced. Perhaps it was just a brief vision. She explained to Darian that she had been captivated by the beauty of the statue, not wanting to share the details. The temple aroused Ellie's suspicions, so she decided to explore other places. Her attention was drawn to a prayer room, or rather, its mystery. It was believed that only the high priest could enter and hear the voices of the gods. The room was filled with an ominous feeling. As she moved further into the temple, Ellie felt that the Marquis of Dior was watching her. Lydiana reassured her, pointing out that the man rarely appeared here, especially in the morning. And even if the Marquis did come, a carriage with the family crest would be waiting at the gate. The lady was undoubtedly right, but there were no rules requiring the carriage to stop at the main entrance. There was a back gate behind the temple, but it was impossible to enter without permission. This entrance was connected to a forbidden forest, so access was restricted. Rumor had it that ancient gods rested in this place. The Duke returned in the company of the high priest Lauda Sekven. When Ellie met him, she did not feel any sacred power, which caused her deep anxiety and doubts about his intentions. Caden declared that he had resolved all issues, so they were returning to the estate. Lydiana was outraged that the Duke did not even ask Ellie's opinion, as she could have stayed longer in the temple. The girl watched the heated discussion between the main character and the Duke. Caden's eyes clearly showed his unwillingness to listen to the young lady. Ellie, feeling uncomfortable, apologized to her friend for having to leave. She promised to arrange another meeting. In the carriage, Ellie suggested to the Duke that he had argued with Lydian because he looked unhappy every time she was mentioned. Caden refuted Ellie's words, claiming that the man was actually interested in her as a woman. He sighed, explaining that he had no feelings for her, which confirmed the deviation of the plot from the original. Ellie decided to change the subject as she was interested in another person, the high priest Laud. The Duke said that he was a gentle person and an extremely talented priest who was one of the first to reach this level. The temple attaches great importance to the amount of holy power a person possesses. Compared to other priests, the high priest's power was simply overwhelming. However, today, Ellie did not feel any energy. The girl asked if Caden had ever seen Laud use his power. The Duke began to suspect something when Ellie continued to ask questions. However, she pretended to be impressed by the high priest's majesty. The man added that he had only seen Laud's abilities once, during a sacred ritual. This ceremony is held twice a year to express gratitude to the gods. Even from a distance, one can feel his incredible power. Ellie began to wonder if she had made a mistake. However, Caden noticed one flaw in Laud. His sister was married to the second son of the Dior family. Perhaps that was why they seemed so similar to the girl. The road to the estate was long, so Ellie decided to stop at a restaurant. Darian, enjoying his freedom outside the house, enthusiastically asked to spend more time on the walk. The girl was already prepared to hear the Duke's refusal, but she was shocked when he unexpectedly agreed. The boy, trying street food for the first time, felt like he had become a normal child. Although he didn't say a word, Caden couldn't hide his dissatisfaction, which was evident on his face. He watched the unsanitary conditions and the clumsy eaters. Ellie even managed to convince the knights. The girl had no intention of giving up. She decided to tempt the Duke with delicious grilled meat and vegetables. Ellie assured him that after he tasted it, she would finally leave him alone. The man concluded that the food was unhealthy and ordered it to be thrown away. Ellie just smiled, as she had no intention of wasting the food. Suddenly, Caden fell silent, then ordered the girl to take Darian and go to the carriage. A figure in a black robe watched them from a distance. Ellie thought until the last moment that the kidnappers would not stick their noses into a crowded place. However, danger was closer than she thought, so she hid in the carriage with Darian. The nanny reassured the boy that everything was fine, although she was troubled by a bad feeling. The Duke was delayed because he had gone after a suspicious person. Soon, the figure disappeared, leaving behind a black aura. Caden was actively investigating. Traces of a curse remained at the scene, although this was only a theory at this point. It seems that this magic feeds on anger, and touching it can taint the soul. Suddenly, Ellie noticed a silhouette in the distance. When she returned to the carriage, she realized that the number of knights had decreased. 2 of them had left with the Duke, and 2 more had gone after the suspicious person. The carriage was guarded by only 3 knights, which, although a considerable force, could not guarantee the safety of Darian, the Duke's heir. Ellie looked out the window and was terrified. They had to escape immediately. The knights standing outside cast no shadows. Ellie decided to use her feminine wiles and tried to convince the men that she was tired of waiting. The girl decided to visit a nearby toy store. She confidently declared that she could manage without an escort. Upon entering the store, she immediately went to the cash register and asked if there was a back door, as she needed to leave unnoticed. The salesman pointed to the door behind him. Ellie and Darian entered and found themselves on a street with many alleys where they could easily hide. The girl asked the salesman to throw the knights off the trail. She didn't know how long her plan would work, so she hurried. Darian stumbled and couldn't go on, so Ellie picked him up. Noise was approaching. They were being followed. They had to find a hiding place quickly. The knights were outraged that the girl was so clever and just as annoying as her father, the Baron. They were already considering selling her to a perverted aristocrat once they found her. It turned out that the Rayan Guild was behind the kidnappings, and their target was not only Darian, but also Ellie. With the death of their leader, the other members were free to act according to their own intentions. The fake knights moved on, never finding the girl or the young heir. At least, Ellie believed there was still hope, but suddenly, they were caught up in a dangerous situation. The attacker grabbed the girl and threatened her with a sword, telling her to obey if she didn't want to get hurt. She bit the man and broke free for a moment, twisting her ankle in the process. Ellie risked her life with her stunt, which greatly angered the attackers. Another man stopped his partner from making rash decisions. After all, if the girl was hurt, her value would decrease significantly. He had no intention of harming Ellie, but he believed that a few bruises on inconspicuous parts of her body were no big deal. Fortunately, the Duke intervened in time to stop him. The girl almost lost consciousness, possibly due to excessive tension or fear. She hastily began to apologize to Caden, believing that her actions were the cause of the trouble. If she hadn't suggested going for a walk, nothing would have happened. The Duke thought it was all nonsense and didn't understand why the girl was apologizing. Instead, he ordered his knights to punish the attackers. Ellie wondered why she felt so sleepy, since the tension had disappeared. Strangely, she found herself back in a place that resembled another dimension, full of mysteries and secrets. A moment later, Ellie found herself in the same forest where she had been before when she was in Rubira's temple. And again, a fluffy white bird appeared before her. A feeling arose in her heart that she must follow it. Feeling fear and uncertainty, but with no other choice, she followed her instincts. Eventually, the bird led Ellie to Duke Caden Nathan, opening the door to a new story. In an instant, she experienced a whole range of emotions, from confusion about why she was there to unexpected peace of mind. It seemed that this meeting had become an integral part of her destiny.